Hello, I'm Grant Bartley. In this video I want to offer an initial solution to the problem of how the electrical and chemical activity between the cells in your brain creates your conscious experience. David Chalmers named this the hard problem of consciousness. To see how our experience is created through brain activity, we will need to consider what must be true about both brain activity and about reality itself. Out of this I will propose a theory about how brain activity generates conscious experience. Throughout this discussion I will say that brain activity generates or creates consciousness, but I'm happy if you want to say that the brain channels consciousness rather than creates it. The latter option may well be true, for all we now know about the nature of reality. To be clear about what we're discussing, by consciousness I specifically mean the having of subjective experience. In what's become a standard phrase in philosophy of mind, consciousness involves there being something it's like to be something. There is something it's like to be you having the experiences you're having now, just as there is presumably something it's like to be a bat having a bat's experiences, or a cat having a cat's. So to say that computers do not have consciousness, for instance, is to say that there's nothing it's like to be the machine. It lacks subjective experience. We know minds exist, don't we? We could even argue the experiencing mind is the only thing we know for sure exists. Cogito ergo cogito, as we might say. Still on the topic of defining our terms, in talking about experience, academics also often talk in terms of percepts or qualia, however you pronounce it, but I will mostly use the term sensations. I'm calling them sensations because sensations, percepts or qualia are those aspects of subjective experience we associate initially with our senses. The blackness of someone's hair, the taste of wheat in a beer, or the notes of a smell of a perfume on skin, or the harmonics of a grand piano in a smoky bar. To put it a bit more formally, sensations are the experiential contents associated with our senses, the sounds you hear, the taste on your tongue, and so on. John Locke called these so-called sensations the secondary qualities of objects. But neuroscience gives us every reason to think that every sensational experience is created through neuronal activity, or channeled or facilitated through it, if you prefer. This is part of what I call the mind-brain connection assumption. The mind-brain connection assumption is the idea that every aspect of every experience in your mind is correlated with activity in your brain. We're trying to work out how this happens. By sensations, I'm clearly talking about our sensory experiences of the outside world, but I also mean the sensory experiences we make up, such as in imagining an image of a dragon, or fantasizing about hearing part of a symphony. From a neurological point of view, there is little difference between external world stimulated and imagined sensations, as both seem to be created through the same operations of the cortex, albeit one is evoked by the stimulation of the eyes, and the other by the reactivation of brain activity of past visual experiences. So in the context of the present discussion, sensations can be real or imaginary, prompted either by the external world or by our brain's creativity. For this discussion, I'll use sight as our main example of basic sensation-filled conscious awareness. To briefly summarize what we know about sight neurologically, light falling on our retinas causes chemical reactions in rod or cone cells which generate electrical impulses. These electrical impulses travel along the optic nerves and soon divide into a stream of pulses for computing non-conscious responses to visual stimuli, and a stream for processing consciously mediated responses. Only the route of optical info processing via the lateral nucleus into the visual cortex involves the creation of conscious sight. We know for good medical reasons that the elements of the contents of the experience of seeing, the colours, the form, the motion, and whatever else of the images you experience, are indeed created or channeled through the human visual cortex. Indeed, activity associated with the human visual cortex is the only physical thing we know with certainty to be immediately associated with an experience of seeing. I'm first going to argue that sensations, qualia or percepts, are the building blocks of all the contents of experience. In other words, no sensations means no experience. So it's my contention that if we can understand how the brain creates conscious sensational experience, then we have the basis for understanding how the brain creates consciousness. So what are these bricks which I'm saying the contents of conscious experience are made from? At their most basic and unstructured, I call the qualities of experience raw sensations, such as simple colours or tones. But sensations are not often experienced as individual qualities. Rather, we experience qualities of sensation in complex arrangements. An image of a woman's face, for example, or a multi-timbered saxophone note. I call these structured sensations. Structured sensations are what philosophers usually call qualia, and neurologists and psychologists call percepts. Laying the jargon out a little, the quality of a sensation is what it would be like to experience a raw individual sensation, and the structure of sensational experience is how various qualities of sensation relate to one another in each experience. Let me emphasize that we don't see the qualities and then put them together. It's not colours first, then form. On the contrary, I think that each experience comes into being not bit by bit, but as the whole experience it is experienced as. Could it be otherwise? Most of the time our experiences are complex, or in other words, have structure. The total contents of any one mode of sensation in any moment of experience is sometimes called a gestalt. And each moment of experience, such as all that you're experiencing now, is formed from many sensations from many different senses. Sensations are this pre-linguistic range of experiences, as we might say. But what are they? As I argue in my video, Why the Mind is Not the Brain, the colours, sounds, textures, etc., as experienced, are the being of those experiences. That is to say, the substance or the very being of sensational experience is the sensations themselves. This emphasizes the hardness of the hard problem, because it now involves one substance creating another, the matter of the brain creating the mind. The question now is, how does the substance of matter in your brain create the mental substance of your experiences? After sensation, experience becomes even more complex by introducing language, but structured sensations are nevertheless the building blocks upon which any experience more complex, such as language comprehension, is built. Consider, you hearing my words depends on you experiencing different pitches and volumes. Even thinking, in the sense of imaginary verbal musing, requires hearing or seeing words or other symbols in your mind, which again requires sensations, this time remembered imaginary ones. I would also justify my assertion that sensations are the building blocks of all complex experience, including language, in a couple of other ways. First, consider the dumb beasts. The evident existence of animals with sense awareness but without language is, I think, an irrefutable reason to believe that conscious awareness is built from the sensational level up. Like me, you probably don't often think to even ask whether dogs, hogs, rats, cats or horses Indeed, all mammals, and probably birds too, have conscious experience. From their behaviour, we simply assume that these animals smell, see, hear, taste and feel the world around them. But we know this is a pre-linguistic level of experience to a large extent. To spell it out, we assume complex animals such as cats and dogs and guinea pigs experience their world sensationally, but without having the full language use that we have. And it's plausible that some animals experience sensations without having any understanding of language at all, even the most rudimentary. Moles, for instance, or a student party late on a Friday night. Even for those species which have any degree of language use, their sensations operate even in the absence of words, as do ours, of course. We too can experience without thinking words, but we can't think any words without thinking the sensations of the words. There can be no language in the absence of sensations then, so sensation is primary. Also, babies come into being without language, but they surely have sensational experience. Sensational experience obviously comes before language evolutionarily too, both logically and paleologically. Of course sensation existed before language, one might say. How could it be otherwise? This is what I'm saying too. I'm saying sensation must be first in the creation of experience content in all ways. Now, in most human experience there is much more than the experience of raw sensations. Experience is more, even, than several raw qualities of sensation thrown together. Such randomness would make experience useless. Rather, our sensational experiences have form, giving shape to what's seen or heard or sensed in any other way. We see trees, people, hear car exhausts or violins. Not only this, but experience also integrates the information from many senses at once. The golf ball that we simultaneously see and touch, for instance. There are also linguistic and intellectual understandings, which are more than merely sensational experiences. There's also awareness that these experiences are happening to one single individual. So going by increasing sophistication, we can break down the main categories of the contents of consciousness into raw sensations, structured sensations, linguistic meaning and higher reflection, which include both reasoning and self-reflection. Other aspects of experience, most notably emotions, I tried to account for using elements from this scheme. But for all experience, if there are no sensational qualities, there's no experience. For now we will ignore the more complex issues to focus on the brain's creation of the building blocks of experience, the raw sensations. Since no sensational experience means no experience, to explain consciousness we need to first explain how sensations, the experience of yellow, the taste of salt, the sound of my words and so on, are generated by chemical exchanges between synapses in pathways in your brain. This means that the core of the problem of how the brain creates consciousness is the problem of how the brain creates sensational experience. Once we've worked that out, we've solved the basic philosophical problem of crossing the great dividing line between the brain and the mind. Once our initial experiences, our sensations, have been created in our brains, rational thought and emotion is no longer philosophically problematic, at least. It may be basically a problem of rearranging experiences, or experiential engineering, if you like. This is why, if we understand sensation, we've solved the hard problem of consciousness. For now we will ignore the complex issues of the structuring of sensation, to focus on the brain's creation of the building blocks of experience, the raw sensations themselves. Before tackling this question, let me make it clear that we're talking specifically about the nature of the immediate activity or momentary state of part of the brain, rather than about the processes that led up to that state. This substantially differs from the approach of some contemporary computational theories of the brain, which are more concerned with the processes that get the brain into a given state of activity. Such computational theories are generally interested in how the brain comes to specify which particular state to enter. In emphatic contrast to that, we're explicitly interested in the activity of the brain after it has computed which experience to create. So we're talking about the neurological activity that immediately creates a sensation, not about how that neurological activity itself came to be. Let's take an example. How could a set of neuronal and synaptic activities create a specific experience of seeing the shade of red of a part of a cherry in a tree? The initial nervous stimulus of our seeing red involves a set of retinal cells being chemically energized through the impact of light which has been reflected off the cherry onto my eyes. This eventually creates color experience, creating neuronal activity centered through the V4 areas of the visual cortex. Some such activity immediately creates the experience of red. But since the physical activity is not itself the colors experienced, nor anything like them, how does this activity create the experience? How is sensation created through electrochemical activity in the brain? Unfortunately, neuroscientists presently know little more about how the brain makes sensations than where different types of sensational processes are headquartered in the brain, and the neurochemistry driving the neural signaling. As impressive as it is to pin that down, it falls abysmally short of telling us how the brain makes sensational experience through these locations using that chemical activity. We know there must be something about neuronal activity in these areas which accesses the associated sensations, because, for instance, when people lose those areas, they lose the experience. This is how we know, for example, where your experience of hearing is made in your brain. Let's focus on the creation of visual sensations. As I've mentioned, the signals from the retina we associate with conscious visual experience are received by the visual cortex. Streams of signals from both eyes spread out across the cortex on the lower back surface of the brain, on both hemispheres, out from the primary visual area V1 at the back of the brain. V1 computes which areas to send the different aspects of retinal information to for processing, for motion or color, for instance. So V1 acts like a switchboard for different types of visual information. The inferior temporal cortex along the bottom of the visual cortex processes the color and form of objects seen, including helping identify objects based on their color and form by comparing that processed information to memories of things seen. Neural signaling, primarily in areas V4 at the rear of the brain, just below your ears, is responsible for the generation of your experience of colors. Again, these color experiences can be real or imaginary, like the gold of the unicorn's horn you may well now be imagining. Well, I say that areas V4 is where your brain makes colors. Of course, it isn't as simple as that. Instead, the two V4s will turn out to be sorting centers for a larger network of brain activity involved in seeing colors. Areas V6 and V7 are also implicated in color experience, for example. There are also areas in the visual cortex on both brain hemispheres for processing form, the shape of our visual percepts, or what I call the structure of visual sensations. The processing of vision structure seems to be concentrated in areas V2 and V3 in almost concentric rings around V1. The apparent motion of what we see is processed a little further up. The form and motion visual areas connect with color processing areas in V4 to V7, and from their interaction we get structured, colourful visual experience, that is, the content of what we call sight. From an engineering point of view, it's interesting that in the case of human vision at least, the brain's computing for the structural aspects of visual experience, the form of what we see, is independent of and may well precede the processing of the qualitative aspects, what sensational experience is made of, including the colours and tones of images. So, computing the form of the experience comes first, and the plan generated is filled in through colour experience creation, coordinated or facilitated through areas V4 to V7. This would be the sort of level of resolution we currently have about what we know is happening in the brain concerning the creation of seeing. We also know a lot about the chemistry involved. Yet we still don't know how conscious sight happens. We don't know, for instance, why electrical activity along nerve wires should create conscious sensation at all. This is what we're currently trying to perceive. The specific question we'll try to answer to understand consciousness generation in the brain is, how can the stimulation of neurons in the visual cortex result in our experience of colours? We perceive red when certain retinal cells detect long wavelength photons, blue for short wavelength light detecting cones, and the wavelength associated with the brain's generation of green experience is in the middle, detected by activating cone cells which react light at about 550 nanometers wavelength. All the other colours we experience are originally due to photons stimulating different combinations of cones in the same part of the retina, leading to different combinations of neuronal activity. But how does this neuronal activity create an experience of colours at all? We should first bear in mind that when we say neuronal activity creates colour experiences, this means that different colours are created by the brain for the experiencing mind. In other words, the colour itself is in the mind, not in the physical world. There are no colours outside mind's experiences of them, only photons of certain physical wavelengths reflecting off objects. That is to say, the light hitting the eye is not itself coloured, rather the colour is in the experience caused by the impact. Generally speaking, colour experience is the mind's representation of light wavelength information received by the retina. But this brings out the truth that the sky is not blue when no one's looking at it, and the grass is not green when no one's looking at it. Indeed, if no one's looking at them, things have no visual appearance whatsoever. Things don't look anything if no one's looking at them. But perhaps I should add that someone is always looking at sky or trees. Point to remember here is, colour experience is an aspect of experience, and so of minds, and not of the physical world independent of minds. And so it is for all sensations, as it must by definition be for all our experiences. All our experiences are created by our brains for our minds. Means that all sensational experiences, such as colours, must be created by or through the brain for the mind. The question is, how? One interesting starting question to address the problem of the brain's generation of consciousness in terms of sensations is, what does the brain do differently in the areas or activities that create or channel or access sensations compared to other brain areas? This question splits into empirical and theoretical questions, or if you prefer, into scientific and philosophical questions. Any observable difference between sensation-creating brain activity and activity in the rest of the brain belongs to the neuroscientists. It will come down to things like the shape of neurons, the nature of the cell's interconnections, the rates of cells firing, and the neurochemistry used, for instance. However, we could know all the biomechanics of how the brain works and still not understand how sensation is created through it all. The hard problem would remain. Brain activity is still nothing like the experience it generates. So we must resort to mere reasoning. And a good question for understanding the theoretical difference between sensation-creating brain activity and other brain activity is, what would any brain activity for creating sensations have to be able to do to create sensations? Take colours, for example. What must the brain activity for creating an experience of colour be able to do in order to create the experiences of colours that we have? One obvious thing is that the processes in our brains must be able to specify the sensations they create or facilitate, at least to the extent of the difference between the sensations we actually experience. If we can experience different types of blue, our brain activity must be able to specify those different tones. Specification is necessary for specific creation, we can say. Neuroscientists are a little way into knowing how different sensations are specified by brain activity. We know, for instance, that colour, that is the wavelength, of an incoming photon is specified through the firing of a bunch of neurons wired together to fire together. This is called distributive coding. Neurologists are still working out the detail of how this physically works. But why should the specification of a light wavelength by brain activity access the experience of a colour? For a mind to experience colours, not only does the brain have to specify the colours to create, it also has to create the experiences specified. So, why does the specific combination of neurons firing upon the retinal impact of a specific wavelength of light result in a specific experience of colour? I'll use the language of experiences being encoded in brain activity, and call the brain activity that directly embodies any specific aspect of experience, such as the neuronal activity directly responsible for creating my experience of the redness of a cherry, the experience's brain code, whatever it turns out to be. In these terms, we would say that each experience is created by its brain code, meaning by the right brain activity. How might a brain code for creating colours work? In line with the idea that our brain activity must specify sensations at least to the degree of specificity to which we can experience differences between sensations, my first working principle for the brain's creation of experience is, to create sensational experiences, brain activity must specify those sensational experiences. Activity in the brain specifies a particular experience of a shade of red, say, and this specification by the brain code allows these experiences of that shade, all the other necessary brain activity for that also being in place and connected up. The next important working principle emerges straight from the first. I've been calling brain activity for colours a code, but we might ask, what is the code for? There must be something objectively meaningful which each sensation code in the brain actually means. For the neuronal sensation code of organised brain activity to be able to actually pick out a sensation, there must be something there for that activity to pick out. But what is it? I can hopefully illuminate what I'm getting at here by applying this idea to colours. If there's nothing that the brain activity specifying colours objectively means, nothing that the brain specifying colours through its activity actually specifies, then that brain activity is specifying nothing and means nothing, as we may say. It's just electricity sparking away in a skull. There must be something objective or natural about colours the brain can use in order to somehow specify colours, in order to create them for experience. Brain activity must specify colour experiences by making use of some aspect of reality which the activity itself stands for. But what is it? What are the brain codes for colour sensations codes for? And the same goes for other types of sensation. How can brain activity specify in order to experience one fragrance rather than another, for example? It can't be just through memory, because the brain has to create the experience of anything it remembers in the first place. We're asking how. Sticking with colours, the question we're now asking is, what about colours could be objectively real in a way that can be referred to by brain activity in order for it to be able to specify those colours? Brain activity must specify colour experiences by making use of some sort of natural relationship colours bear to one another, I think. However it works, neuronal activity must systematically specify each colour experience, or it's hard to see how the brain could be responsible for creating that specific colour experience. How would the code in your brain access that particular shade of cherry red of that cherry, if the colour were not distinguished from alternative shades naturally and systematically? If there were nothing systematic about the relationships between colours intrinsic to reality itself, as we may say, then there could be nothing that the interconnected activity of neurons and synapses could systematically refer to, that is, specify, and so access, when creating the experience of colours. This implies a natural ordering of colours which the brain taps into. A familiar picture or two might help us think about this concept of the natural logical ordering of sensations such as colours. You've probably seen a colour wheel or a palette of colours in a graphics program from a paint shop. Let us call any such representation of sets of colours arranged systematically relative to one another a chart of colours. The wheel and the palette are two different charts of colours. Now think of the systematic relationship between different colours as displayed by this type of chart in the abstract. In other words, conceptualize the sort of arrangement of the colours one to another without actually visualizing them. This is one way to conceive of a natural arrangement of colours relative to one another. Whenever I mention the natural ordering of the colours, you might therefore think of it in terms of a colour chart, but in the abstract. The idea I'm getting at is that colours are naturally logically ordered relative to one another in the sort of way that they'd be on a chart, in the same sort of way that numbers are naturally logically ordered relative to one another. And this is supposed to hold for any possible experience of colour. Imagine, for instance, a chart of each possible tone of purple arranged relative to one another, like swatches on a colour chart, but allowing for infinitesimal gradations and as many dimensions as are needed to get the relationships between the different colours right. Next, imagine the arrangements of purples not on paper, but in the abstract, that is, by somehow keeping the order but without imagining any actual purple colour. That would be the natural ordering of the purples. And I think we can think in this sort of way about any type of sensation we might experience. or about any sensation experienced by any creature with a brain for that matter, for those veterinary neuroscientists among you. Please note that this idea of a natural abstract chart of colours for brain activity to specify is not supposed to be taken literally, as if there were some logical data bank in some abstract logical dimension recording the relationships between smells, sights and feelings. The idea of brain activity specifying coordinates on an abstract chart of sensations is for illustration purposes only. That is, it hopefully helps us grasp what's going on, without necessarily being a literal picture of how things are. I think of it as a metaphor to help illustrate the idea that all sensations have a natural ordering which can be exploited by the brain in experience creation. Other metaphors for the natural ordering of sensations are available. For instance, we might well think of landscapes of sensation rather than charts of them. The logical relationships between sensations for any type of sensation would require a multi-dimensional landscape, I would think. And you might want to use a completely different metaphor for what sensational brain activity is specifying. I'm sure people will come up with different models. But brain activity must be specifying something specifically sensational. We know that there is some brain process for systematically accessing sensational experiences, and whichever of these ideas holds for one type or aspect of sensation, we might suppose holds for other types or aspects of sensation, until given good reason to suspect otherwise. There are indeed many different ways in which the natural relative positions of a given set of sensations might be conceived. The relationships might be modelled through a set of equations, for example. However, the idea of mutual sensation ordering is nicely visualized by a colour chart, I think. We're thinking of the natural relative positions of colours or other sensations because this helps us understand how the brain can create or facilitate sensational experience. Logical ordering shows us a way any sensations can be specified by information, for instance, mathematically. However it does it, the mind-brain connection assumption demonstrated by neuroscience tells us that the information through which any sensation we have is specified is encoded in brain activity. I'm supposing that what the brain connects with in specifying sensations is the natural logical relationship between them. To use our metaphor, the idea is that the right combination of neurons and synapses firing embodies a code that refers to the colour position on its natural chart. You can see with a colour chart that the position of a colour relative to its fellows can potentially easily be given by specifying the right information, through coordinates for instance. So too might the brain specify a particular colour by specifying the position on the chart of the natural logical ordering of colour sensations through specifying coordinates. So we can say that sensations are created because particular brain activity specifies a relative position in the natural logical ordering of the type of sensation through something equivalent to coordinates. This might be said for any type of sensation. The chart metaphor can be suitably mutated to apply to any sensational experiences to describe the natural systematic ordering of tastes, tones, touches and so on. And even in the case of visual sensations, colour is not the only raw ingredient. For example, shade is a different type of visual sensation from colour, so it too would have its own metaphorical charts for brain activity to point to. Since brain activity is responsible for the shading we see of, say, a face in a room, it would have to specify from the range of degrees and designs of possible shade experiences, dappled, mottled, flowing, deep, or delicate. These might be thought of as being specified on a complex chart of natural logical arrangements of possible shadings. Metaphors aside, my core idea about how the brain specifies sensations is that with the right information, any quality of sensation can be specified in terms of its natural position relative to other similar qualities. This is how, as we might say, any brain activity means the sensation it specifies. But how or why should specification of particular sensation information by brain activity result in the experience of that sensation? This question is indeed the exact kernel of the hard problem of consciousness. If we can answer this question for colour, then we can say how the brain creates our experience of colour. If we can then generate a principle from this answer that we can use for all types of sensation, then we have a principle for how the brain can create sensational experience, and so would have the philosophical foundations to understanding how the brain creates experience at all. Although we know brain activity must specify one type of perceived sensation rather than another, even if we could point this brain activity out, we're still talking in terms of chemical activity in the brain, which is nothing like the sensational experience this activity is specifying. For instance, the neuronal activity in your visual cortex specifying your retina's impact by red wavelength light looks nothing like the image of red which that activity generates. And the neuronal activity in your audio cortex doesn't sound like any of the sounds being generated for your experience of hearing either. And so on for all sensations. There's nothing in your brain that smells like the coffee you brew for your morning jolt, or nothing in your sensory cortex that feels like velvet when you're rubbing that fabric, etc. So for brain activity to create experience requires ideas about the nature of reality, or as philosophers call them, metaphysical principles. What must be true about reality itself for the right physical activity in the brain to create experience? What would we need to assume about the nature of reality for the brain to be able to create conscious experience as it does? I think the first metaphysical principle necessary to explain the brain's creation of experience is the evident truth that reality includes the potential for the creation of conscious content to minds in the right circumstances. Alternatively put, this first metaphysical principle for consciousness is that physical activity can create experience with content. To give it its formal definition and full title, the first metaphysical principle of embodied consciousness is that reality allows the creation of conscious content through physical activity. But this principle should not surprise us. We are physical beings, and yet we are conscious. But we can usefully rephrase this principle as, when the physical world is ordered in the right way, experience is created or facilitated for a mind. That's evidently true, I know, but we should start by laying good foundations concerning what reality must be like. At the moment, the only way we know for sure to organize matter to produce minds gives us our second metaphysical principle, which is that when some mental quality is accurately physically instantiated or underwritten by brain activity, that experiential content is created for a mind. Or in simpler terms, the second metaphysical principle is that the right brain activity produces experiences. But we know brain activity produces your thoughts now, or a flashing vision of the colour red, or any other experience you've ever had by your embodied human mind. There is some correct activity the brain implements which creates sensational experience for experiencing minds. If it didn't, you wouldn't be experiencing this, for example. The second metaphysical principle of mind means precisely that the nature of reality is such that when neuronal and synaptic activity represents an experience in the right way, that experience is created for a mind. When neuronal activity picks out sunflower yellow in the right way, for instance, that experience of the sunflower's colour is created for that mind seeing the flower, and so on for all other aspects of experience. But what does the right brain activity mean? What is the right way for a set of active neurons to create an experience of colour, for instance? However brain activity does it, whether through picking out sensations from the natural ordering of sensations or some other way, to create sensations, brain activity must specify sensations, because your sensational experiences are not random, but applied to the world in a regular way. Whatever it turns out to be, I'm calling the brain activity that specifically specifies a sensation the brain code for that sensation, or sometimes the sensation code. We know sensation codes exist because we can kill the sensations by killing bits of the brain. How widespread throughout the brain and the nervous system generally the code for creating sensations is another issue, and a more empirical one. Now, for a brain to specify a sensation in the right way, perhaps in, as I've argued, a way that tunes into the natural logical ordering of whatever mode of sensation we're talking about, is to accurately physically instantiate that sensation by definition. Applying our second metaphysical principle, when some mental activity is accurately physically instantiated by brain activity, the embodied experiential content is created to this fact about sensations. We can derive a third metaphysical principle, all the other necessary brain activity for that also being in place and connected up. By precisely specifying experiences in the right way, brain activity makes those experiences real to an aware mind. And since sensations are the building blocks of experience, this is the first idea for how the brain creates consciousness. I'll christen this idea of how your conscious experience is first created by sensation activity in your brain the sensation code hypothesis. The sensation code hypothesis says that by precisely specifying sensations in the way that it does, brain activity makes those sensations real to or for an aware mind. Subjective experience has two inseparable sides to it, the subject and the experience. There's no experience without an awareness experiencing it. No mental content without a mind, as we might say. So if, as our second metaphysical principle says, the correct specification of an experience by the brain is enough to create the experience, then creation of an experience is, of necessity, also enough to create the experiencer, at least at that moment of experience. What makes a moment's awareness into a person includes connecting together the experiences through time, so that your mind experiencing this now is connected by memory to the mind that had your experiences earlier. But enduring personhood would be the subject of another discussion entirely. The fact that there must be something specific for neuronal activity to specify to create the experience specified helps us to avoid the result that just any systematic representation of a sensation will create sensational experience. For instance, the processing of light in a digital camera does not create the sensation of that colour for the camera. Generally speaking, we could say that current artificial processing of colour data does not create an experience of colour sensations for machines, since, among other reasons, this processing does not specify colour sensations in anything like the way the brain does it. A brain's colour experience activity is the minimum known requirement for the creation of colour experience. That is to say, the camera's chip might direct how to create different wavelengths of light on a screen in response to similar light being received through a lens. But that's very different from activity precisely specifying the position of a colour on its natural logical array. Digital cameras presuppose the existence of minds who perceive colours, or viewers such as human beings looking at the images. But because we haven't deciphered sensation codes yet, we haven't yet created subjective sensational experience in a computer, as I've argued elsewhere. So how might your brain create your experience of colour? The first aspect is the idea that neuronal activity centred in the V4s, which no doubt coordinate activity wide-ranging throughout the brain, specifies a colour by encoding or embodying that colour's relative position on the natural abstract equivalent of a colour chart. Combining this idea with the first necessary metaphysical principle for the existence of experience, that reality includes the potential for the creation of minds with conscious content in the right circumstances, yields the sensation code hypothesis for colour. A colour experience is created when neuronal and synaptic events centering around the V4 areas embodies a code specifying the position of that colour in the natural arrangement of colours. And this is how your experience of colour is created through your brain activity. The creation of experience through sensation-specifying brain activity relies on the second mind-brain metaphysical principle. To spell that out, when some mental quality is referred to or otherwise embodied physically in precisely the right way in the brain, that mental quality is experienced. This principle must hold somehow for the brain's physical activity to be responsible for the creation of the contents of our experience. But why should it work? What must be true about reality for the embodiment of precise information in the brain activity to create experience? The first thing we'll need to do to answer this question is to divide up reality realistically. Physical things happen in physical space, evidently, and have other physical properties. But the mind's content, your thoughts, feelings, and sensory experiences, do not themselves extend across physical space as the brain does. Thoughts don't take up physical space themselves. René Descartes already correctly noted this at the beginning of the 17th century. More generally, matter must have physical properties just to be matter, but the contents of your experiencing mind have only mental properties. So, the contents of mind, having no physical properties, cannot be said to be physical. Although it's created by the brain's physical activity, the mind is not itself a physical thing. In particular, it's not the brain. So, in precisely the same way that a cake is made by a chef but not often of a chef, although mind is made by matter in the brain, mind is not made of matter. As I mentioned earlier, substance is what something is ultimately made of, and experiences are exactly what they are experienced to be. So as I would philosophically put it, the substance of the brain is matter, but the substance of experience is experience, including all your thoughts and choices. Mind and matter are not only different things, then, they're different substances. Being not themselves physical things, having no physical substance and no physical properties, including not extending across physical space, it also makes no sense to say that mental contents such as experiences and thoughts and the minds that have them happen in physical space. I'll call the realm of the mind and conscience contents mental space. According to this jargon, mental events happen in mental space, or mental things exist in mental space. The term mental space is in distinct contrast to physical space, the realm of physical objects and events. Physical space includes brains and interneuronal electrochemical reactions, but doesn't include the minds or experiences those reactions create. We can say, for instance, then, that physical space interacts with mental space through the brain. In these terms, the second metaphysical principle allowing the brain to create conscious experience could be phrased as precisely specifying potential experiences in physical space in the right way makes those experiences real in mental space. But how does dividing reality into physical and mental domains, contents, and properties help us solve the hard part of the mind-body problem? How is conscious experience created through brain activity? In particular, how does it explain how a sensation such as a colour is created by the brain? Our sensational principle, by precisely specifying sensations in the way it does, brain activity makes those sensations real to or for an aware mind, is evidently true. But why is it true? Why can the special specification of information create experience, such as an experience of colour, at all? I think we can explain the creation of experience by brain activity in terms of information existing simultaneously in physical and mental ways in the brain and mind. Experience happens when a physical configuration is also simultaneously a mental information configuration, then. Let's consider this idea for a moment. In mental terms, information is information that has meaning to a mind, and it corresponds with specific elements of experience. This information may be purely sensational, so that a given red experience, say, would itself be a bunch of information. Or it could include the more complex information conveyed in language. This information can also be embodied in physical activity. So information embodied in specific interneuronal and synaptic activity has a specific meaning in mental space, and that meaning is the experiences and thoughts we experience and think. And this is the metaphysical reason why the brain can create conscious experience. Let me put it in mental space terms because I think this helps clarify the connections. Our metaphysical principle, or truism, physical activity can create experiential contents, can be phrased as something in physical space can also have meaning in mental space. However, having meaning in mental space simply means, that is, denotes, that there exists some experiential contents for a mind. It means that if the right sort of activity is expressed in just the right way in physical space, for example through brain activity, that same information has objective meaning in mental space in terms of generating experience content. In mental space, for information to have meaning means that the experience exists. And so, brain activity creates your experiences because your brain activities embody codes that have objective experiential meaning in mental space. The brain specifying a particular colour in the sort of way we've looked at has meaning in mental space as the colour. In summary, I think experience happens because certain configurations of physical behaviour, primarily certain brain activities, have objective meaning in the world of experience, mental space, as experiences. We could say that there is an actualization in mental space of the meaning of the information in physical space. In sensational terms, my starting idea for the solution to the hard problem of consciousness is that sensational information encoded in physical activity has meaning in mental space as experienced sensations. Or if you prefer, sensational experience is the brain's sensational information decoded naturally in mental space. This is how you're experiencing your sensations right now, as your experience of colours, for instance. And, as I contend, sensations are the foundations of all conscious experience. I can sum up why physical activity can create consciousness in 4 phrases. 1. Just as physical activity occurs in physical space, mental activity occurs in mental space. 2. In certain configurations of physical activity, information configured in physical space can also be information configured in mental space. 3. Information in mental space just means various experience contents to a mind, from the simplest to the most complex. 4. So a brain code in physical space can be simultaneously an experience code in mental space, creating experiences from the simplest to the most complex. In this way, physical brain activity can create your experience. In current neurological terms, my theory might also be broadly summarized as: the logic of the active connectome describes thought into being, where the connectome means directly experience relevant neuronal activity. Evidently, this all relies on there being a space of objective mental meaning, which I'm calling mental space. But there evidently is a space where our minds and experiences exist. Is it physical space? Well, what on earth does this space have in common with physical space, except the information that links them, translating between the spaces? We happen to have the same information in 2 spaces, the physical and the mental. This allows us to summarize this solution to the hard problem of consciousness as: information in physical space, in brains, is also information in mental space, in minds. In its most basic terms, my mind-brain connection theorem is that the information in the brain state equals the information in the mind state, or any other useful variant of these concepts. The relationship between the mind and the brain can perhaps best be sloganed as: the information in the brain is the information in the mind. What does a sensation code look like in the brain? What form does activity for experiencing a particular shade of cherry red take, for example? We know where the activity is centered in the brain for creating the different sensations, and some of the connections and some of the activity involved, including some of the chemical reactions involved in the signaling. Unfortunately, this knowledge is nowhere near detailed enough yet, even for us to describe the general nature of the sensation codes in the brain, let alone deciphering those codes. Indeed, we're at the very beginning of understanding how brain activity encodes aspects of subjective experience. Moreover, decoding a brain's code for a sensation would be like doing a jigsaw puzzle, but not only do we not know what the picture looks like, we don't even know how many dimensions or pieces we're dealing with. So we don't really know what we're looking at. So before asking how the brain might specifically code for colours, or for any other sensation, perhaps we'd better first ask, how in principle might brain activity embody a sensation code? Any means of encoding something, any way of making something systematically stand for something else, must work in terms of some set of rules. But what rules? Maybe we can narrow the search down by further asking, how could neuronal activity create any sort of code for anything? The perhaps most obvious idea is that brain codes specifying, say, sensation coordinate values work through means similar to how numbers are represented or manipulated in computers. Any mathematical quantity can be represented through the complex combinations of simple logical operations. This is how a computer can work, because maths is logic applied to numbers, that is, to quantities. In this sense, maths is the complex combination of simple logical operations. And computers use logic gates to perform the processing we eventually see as mathematics. Logic gates either pass received signals on or switch them off according to a logic. And so, a programmer inputs a set of rules which causes the behavior of the electricity flowing through a CPU to emulate the working of mathematics. What the programmer has to do is to get the computer's logic gates to open and shut in a way that produces results that appear to us as appropriately mathematical. Computer circuits and neurons are similar as being off or on signal processors. Neurons, or more probably synapses, could act as logic gates on nerve impulses, so for example representing numbers or manipulating quantities, and so for example representing coordinates. A major part of any code for sensation must be specifying the sensation created. So, for the sake of having any model of what the brain's doing when it's creating a raw sensational experience, I'll suppose that the sensation code operating between the neurons and synapses specifies the relative natural coordinates of the sensation. This means that the coordinates specifying, and so creating, a particular experience of colour is embodied, for instance, in the logic of a specific set of neurons and synapses firing in response to a particular wavelength of light. Using our chart metaphor, then, we would say that a neuronal code for a sensation could specify the equivalent of numerical coordinates for the sensational experience, first through logic operating through neurons and synapses in a way basically similar to how computers specify numbers. Further neuronal activity would then combine these values together to specify the complete coordinates for any given sensation, such as a particular tone of cherry red. If anything like this is what happens, this would be about as close the human brain gets to working like a computer, I would think. Trying to conceive how the brain code for sensations could operate brings to mind another important line of questions about the physical nature of the code. Is the code for sensations embodied in the changing logic of the firing of certain synapses, for instance, or something else? For the sake of relative simplicity, let's suppose that the basic brain code for all its information processing is in binary. Here, on the easiest scheme, 1 and 0 could be seen as on and off, such that in neural terms, electrical pulse versus no electrical pulse represents the basic 1 and 0. If so, a code for a coordinate value could conceivably be manifested through a system of active versus inactive synapses and neurons. Unfortunately, however, the brain code is unlikely to be so simple. There's difficulties involved with pinpointing exactly where and when nothing specifically occurs, for instance. How is an inactive neuron or synapse different from no neuron or synapse? More significantly, current neuroscientific thinking on how neuronal activity conveys information is that it's not through the simple on and off of electrical pulses. Instead, it's now thought that information is conveyed through changes in brain activity, rather than in terms of just the on or off of pulses. In this thinking, an increased rate of firing compared to a decreased rate of firing is the basic medium or bit of information for the codes of the brain. So, in line with current neuroscience, let's say that sensation code involves changes in the relative rapidity of neuronal and/or synaptic firing. The information conveyed through this activity can then be logically manipulated to specify relative coordinate values, specifying a potential color experience, for instance. Here, the brain's code for sensation works on the basis of the logical relations between changing rates of neuronal activity in some yet undeciphered way. So let's look at a few of what I think are the more likely ways neuronal events might encode information. I'll use color experience as my example, but I think it would be similar for other sensations too. We're primarily interested in information encoded in neuronal activity stretching from the stimulation of the retinal cells through to activity in the V4 color processing headquarters of the visual cortex. In response to the initial stimulus of a photon hitting a specific cone cell receptive to that wavelength on your retina, a specific set of neurons change their firing patterns across the brain, centered in the colored processing areas of the visual cortex. It seems to me quite possible that only the complete neuronal activity from the retina throughout the brain all the way to the colored areas of the visual cortex and outwards, and no doubt incorporating other crucial areas on the way, might embody a code unique enough to specify a color. The red associated with a certain wavelength light, for instance. An even more sophisticated approach would say that it is some yet unknown subset of any and all of this activity. If so, each color experienced is encoded by an unknown subset of all the brain activities stimulated from cone to color cortices and outwards. As a basic hypothesis, we can say that your brain specifies the color experience with the right combination of neurons and synapses firing. It would then be a very tricky empirical question identifying what this combination of neuronal activity specifically is. Let's stick with considering the brain code for just one color aspect of an experience, say a particular shade of red. Working out how this color code operates would involve precisely matching different sets of neuronal activities with different color experiences, and then looking for the patterns. When we've systematically collected, collated and analysed this data, we'll have made some good first steps in understanding the brain's code for colour, and so the mechanics of how the brain creates consciousness, from the creation of sensational experience up. but colour experience is only the baseline for vision. The description of visual experience and the corresponding neurological traces necessarily become more complex, combining colours and adding shades, and placing the colours and shades within an ordered visual structure which is moving and changing. Also, you can imagine colours using your memory nodules rather than the stimulus coming through your retina, which ramps up the complexity. Nevertheless, we can say in general terms that it is the simultaneous, interconnected activity of all the involved neuronal areas, all the relevant activity in all the relevant brain nuclei, which creates the complex contents of visual experience. For example, seeing a cheetah running at you. What then about the structure of sensations, not just their quality? The apparent spatial structure of visual experience, the shape of what you see, not entirely surprisingly, seems to track the spatial structure described by photons falling on the retina. This indicates that, just as we have said with the brain code for the creation of the sensational quality itself, the code for visual structure is embodied in unknown parts of the whole of the relevant brain activities, from the pattern of the activation of the rod and cone cells outwards. Unfortunately, time doesn't allow me to consider the brain structuring of sensations further. We might say that generally, any sensation code in the nervous system for any aspect of sensational experience potentially begins with the nervous activity initiated by the sense mechanisms and spreading out across the brain. Metaphysically speaking, most basically, you are the content of your minds, the connected contents of all your experiences. Add in the power of change to experience, that is, the power of will, and we get minds. These contents of experience that constitute you exist expressed in mental space. But what is your physical nature? Even if we were to allow that we have answered, at least as a first pass, the how and the why of the brain's creation of experience, we might still ask, what then are you, physically speaking? What is the precise thing in your brain which supposedly embodies the mental information expressed in all your subjective experience? For a first instance, is the physical embodiment of the code for mental content found in the shape in space of all the electrical fields produced by neuronal and synaptic activity? Or is the information informing your mind rather embodied in the shape in time of the relative activity of the neurons and synapses? By which I mean the logical ordering through time of neuronal and synaptic electrical and chemical action. The neurological evidence presently leans heavily towards brain information existing through processes occurring through time rather than being organized across space in the brain. But I don't know if we could ever rule out there being a spatial element to the code. However, the brain code is evidently most basically embodied as a pattern through time of synaptic and neuronal firing activity. So one might suggest that the actual physical thing by or in which the elements of experience are encoded are the local electrical fields generated by the movement of molecules through the nervous system, in particular at the synapses. This would hold for all the elements of experience and thought. If so, the electricity in your neurons and synapses chemical activity literally physically constitutes the code for your consciousness. In other words, The codes creating all your experiences and thoughts are embodied in the shifting patterns of tiny electrical fields in your brain. So what ultimately embodies experience is subtle electrical fields in the brain. Physically speaking, ultimately, you are electricity. Your mind's grounded into the physical world through galaxies of sparks in your brain. There's nothing very novel about the idea that, physically, ultimately speaking, the body aspect of embodied minds are complex electrical fields created through complex neuronal and synaptic activity. The novel idea here is that conscious experience happens through brain activity because patterns of electrical fields in interneuronal and intersynaptic electrochemical activity have natural informational meaning. First, the electrical information embodies a code specifying particular sensations, such as any sensations you happen to be experiencing now. So another way of briefly phrasing my theory about how brain activity creates experience is that our experience can be created through the activity of our brains because fluctuations in the electrical field of the brain happen in just the right way to have natural experiential meaning. This being first in terms of specifying and creating sensations. What's the point or area in the physical world where consciousness is first created? A prime candidate for the jumping off point from the physical world into the world of experience is the specification of a sensation by neuronal activity, this being perhaps the most refined biological processing immediately evoking experience. So, for the sake of argument, I'll take the physical world's initial creation of consciousness to be brain activity's acute specification of sensation, just because that's the point of the brain's sharpest resolution of the foundations of experience. If that's so, then where experience is first created physically is the brain activity we've been thinking about, by which sensations have specified neuronally. I'm saying now that as far as we know, this activity is the initial point of the creation of consciousness in the physical world. This is in distinct contrast to, say, Descartes, who thought the point of contact of mind and brain was the pineal gland, which actually controls hormones. Of course, once brain activity is specified as sensation, other brain mechanisms will also be employed to create sensational experience, such as the activity required to place each colour experience within the structure of a visual experience, and all the complex neurological feedback mechanisms no doubt necessary to create a sense of self-awareness here too. A lot of further activity throughout the brain will no doubt be necessary for experience of even one colour to come into being. But we know that distributed activity focused in the B4 areas refers precisely to colour experiences. So I'll take this activity to be the focus or the root of the brain's creation of colour experience. This is where colour experience is first physically created or channeled by the brain. Perhaps you're not convinced by my metaphysical prerequisites for the brain's channeling of the mind, or other aspects of what I've argued. Whatever you don't like about this model of how neuronal activity creates sensations, or any other model, in order to create or channel any experience, brain activity must be able to specify that experience. But even once computational neurological activity has specified which experience to be created, the hard problem remains. How does the specification of a sensation actually create that experience? I sought to answer this question by asking, what needs to be true about reality itself for the brain's specification of a sensation to result in an experience of that sensation? My solution requires the metaphysical principles for consciousness in any of the forms I've said them. The first principle is, reality must be such that when some content of experience is specified in the right way, that experience content is created. The second principle applies this principle specifically in the human mind-brain situation. When some mental quality is accurately physically instantiated by brain activity, the embodied experiential content is created for a mind. We know, for example, that brain activity for colours includes specifying information in the right way to create our experience of colour. We imagine this information as if it were referring to the colour's coordinates on a colour chart. The first metaphysical principle, that for minds to exist as they clearly do, reality must allow minds to exist in the right circumstances, I take to be a natural fact about the world, an intrinsic part of how the world is. Or, to take a more specific example, the creation of sensational experience from the right physical activity in nervous systems sustained in the right physical environment is an intrinsic part of the nature of reality. Understanding conscious embodiment then becomes a question of specifying the right physical circumstances precisely enough. I don't think just saying neuronal activity creates or channels consciousness is enough information to understand very much. But I also think we're far from knowing the neuronal details of the brain's creation of the elements of conscious experience, as well as very far from understanding the metaphysical details about the nature of reality. For instance, why is reality such that it allows the generation of experiences from configurations of physical activity, as it evidently does? In other words, what does it mean that there exists an objective potential for experiential meaning? Are we to suppose without further explanation that a mind just pops into being whenever a code is specified physically in the right way to have meaning in mental space, and that's all there is to be said about it? Or is there more to be said? Personally, I think the physical universe at the subatomic level is ultimately a set of quantum information processing systems in the mind of God. In other words, consciousness is already intrinsic to physical reality in a very specific way. And not at all like Berkeleian idealism, by the way. But I think this idea goes a long way into explaining the possibility of consciousness in the physical world through physical brain activity. For a start, it means that even the physical world is ultimately information for a mind on a subatomic level. On this account, mind and experience are metaphysically primary, with matter, indeed the entire physical world as we know it, being a construct from quantum information processes. But that's another discussion altogether. I think that I've presented here some good starting principles for thinking about how the brain creates your consciousness. The most crucial point to remember is, the information in the brain is the information in the mind. Thank you.